This coat is one of the star pieces in the V&A's collections, and it's one of the most wonderful examples of Elsa Schiaparelli's work. We're very lucky to have it. It really does represent a kind of culmination of Schiaparelli's tour de force embroidery techniques, and we're going to look a little bit more in detail at some of those elements today. I'm Sonnet Stanfill, Senior Curator of Fashion at the V&A, and we're here today to talk about a very special garment in the V&A's collection that was designed by the interwar fashion designer Elsa Schiaparelli, who was born in Rome, based in Paris, and became, through garments like this, one of the most discussed designers of interwar Paris. This evening coat was part of her 1937 collection to mark the Exposition Internationale in Paris. This coat was designed by Schiaparelli, but based on a drawing by the artist and filmmaker Jean Cocteau, which still exists. It's in the collection of West Dean, which Schiaparelli realized onto the back of this evening coat with the help of the embroidery firm Maison Lesage, which was and still is known for its incredible embroidery craftsmanship. And Schiaparelli, in her autobiography, she talked about working with artists like Jean Cocteau, like Man Ray, like Salvador Dali. And the word that she used to describe that collaborative experience was exhilarating. And I think you get a sense of the joy and pleasure that she must have taken in working with an artist like Jean Cocteau when you look at the back of this jacket. What strikes you first is this wonderful trompe-l'oeil or trick of the eye approach. Not only are they illusionistic, in the sense that we are looking at either two faces looking at each other, or we're looking at a vase with an explosion of roses across the shoulders. The vase is perched on a column, which is also a kind of trompe-l'oeil device. It's picked out in metallic thread onto the surface of the garment. So it's a very exuberant, almost storytelling approach to dressing. And this is realized through a variety of techniques. Applique for the roses, which you can see at the top. They're intentionally kind of varied in color, from a kind of fuchsia to a pale light pink. I think over time the color on some of the roses will have faded, so probably originally it was much more vibrant. But I think initially it was always intended to have a kind of variety of color. In addition, the roses are complemented by these wonderful delicate leaves, which are picked out in silk floss embroidery. And so they add a kind of touch of pastel to kind of complement the pink. And the roses are held in a vase, the outline of which is picked out in metallic thread. One of the things that really stands out are the eyes of the two figures, because they're a beautiful shade of blue, and that's achieved through using both kind of light blue silk floss embroidery, and in the center is a bright blue plastic bead, which also, because it's faceted, it kind of glints and glimmers in the light. So it's a wonderful addition or injection of color on the surface of this coat. And the top of the vase has a wonderful detail, which is this line of flat strip embroidery. And these are hammered metal strips. And that was a particular technique that Schiaparelli encouraged the house of Lesage, Maison Lesage, to use this on many of her evening coats and evening jackets. And quite a few examples in the V&A exist in our collection of pieces that feature this flat strip embroidery technique. And what's really useful about it is the way that it catches the light. It also is very useful in the way that it can pick out an outline, and it has a real presence on the surface of the garment. It's probably tarnished over time, but it gives you a sense of the glitter and gleam that must have been achieved when you wore this in candlelight or out in the evening. And the flat strip embroidery is not just, she didn't just use one color. She encouraged the house of Maison Lesage to also use color examples of flat metal strip. And you can see that here in the lips. It's the same material, but colored ruby red. And again, this idea of tracing the outline, mimicking the drawing that Cocteau created. The embroidery is almost used in a kind of draftsman-like way to pick out the sides of the vase, and then this wonderful trompe-l'oeil column, which trails down the back of the dress. The fluting looks very realistic. The coat is fastened by a typically unusual Schiaparelli button. The button is shaped like the circular skirt of a can-can dancer with a single leg pointing downwards. So if you look twice, you'll see that this button is very unusual, but also quite typical of Schiaparelli's sense of humor. What's, I think, really remarkable is when you look at the back of this coat, how neatly and perfectly the illustration is sized to fit exactly onto the back of the wearer, just in between the shoulders, and the way that, of course, the roses kind of trail delicately down the sides. So it's kind of positioned beautifully. And so all of these elements are brought together to kind of make Jean Cocteau's drawing come to life. This is an haute couture coat. That means that it was made to measure for the individual client, in this case, the Viscountess Castlerosse, who was a notable socialite in the 1930s. She was friends with Cecil Beaton. She sat for several photographic portraits taken by Beaton. And she was a very bold dresser, as you can tell, because this coat is quite a statement. And from a distance, as the wearer walked away, you would have been noticed and you would have probably encouraged people to look twice. And she bought it at Schiaparelli's London atelier. Schiaparelli, of course, was based in Paris at 21 Place Vendôme, the heart of luxury in Paris, but she also opened a London couture outpost in the very fashionable Mayfair district. She was located at number 6 Upper Grosvenor Street. And her clients who were based in London therefore no longer had to travel to Paris to buy Elsa Schiaparelli designs. They could go to the London couture salon and place their orders and have their fittings done there. So this coat actually has a Schiaparelli London label. And so the owner, Viscountess Castlerosse, would have bought it from the Mayfair outpost. So it was made to measure for the individual client, but that doesn't mean that it was the only one that existed. Multiple clients we know bought this design, and there are a few other examples in other museum collections. Nonetheless, it's very rare. It would have been very costly at the time. Haute couture was only affordable by a limited few, and certainly a garment like this, because it's so covered with incredible embroidery and different embroidery techniques, would have been very time-consuming to make, and therefore the cost would have been commensurate with that. It's not atypical, though, for Schiaparelli, who I think encouraged her own clients to dress boldly, and she created conversation starters with clothes like this. And I think that the women who wore the clothes, like the Viscountess Castlerosse, would have had to have a lot of confidence to walk into a room wearing something like this. One of the things that Elsa Schiaparelli was known for was her glittering roster of clients. She dressed some of the most notable women of her time, and those women included people like the Duchess of Windsor, also actresses like Marlene Dietrich and Mae West, who she costumed for films, and she also dressed sportswomen like the aviator Amy Johnson, who was the first woman to fly from London to South Africa. So these are some of the examples of the notable women and the kind of fearless dressers that Elsa Schiaparelli designed garments for. The garment actually survives in good condition, although I think that there's been some fading in the roses, so they're not quite maybe as vibrant as they used to be, but they're still very colorful and very exuberant as they kind of explode across the shoulders of the coat. They have become quite fragile and brittle over time, and so our textile conservation colleagues have done some very delicate repair work, which is to shore up some of the petals of flowers, because over time the silk has become quite brittle and has started to kind of split on the ends where the embroidered flowers fold over to create that petal. What they've done is they've taken silk crepeline, which has a bit of adhesive on it. It's very, very sheer material. They've dyed it exactly the color to match the petal area that they've worked on, and they've folded it over, and the adhesive sticks to the silk and disappears visually. So it's a kind of magic touch on the flowers to make them stronger and more robust. And this conservation work was done so expertly that it's helped to keep the garment safe. So this evening coat really sums up some of the best of Elsa Schiaparelli's designs. It illustrates her work with artists like Jean Cocteau. It showcases incredible embroidery techniques, and it also features whimsical details like the button that we saw fastening the coat, shaped like a dancer's leg. Altogether, I think these things really make it one of the most unique and special Elsa Schiaparelli garments in the V&A's collections.